By sunrise on January 1st, 1946, the stock boss at a New Year's exhibition ground in Kerr County, Texas, stood alone in the center of the arena holding a dog collar that was still clasped shut. The leather was damp. It smelled faintly of smoke, though no fire had been lit anywhere near the chutes that night. The blue heeler that collar belonged to, a dog named Spur, had vanished sometime between the last firework and the stroke of midnight, and the way he vanished left marks in the dirt that shouldn't have been possible to make. Kerr County sits in the hill country of central Texas, where the land rolls in dry waves of mesquite and limestone, and the winter air turns sharp after sundown, even when the days stay warm. The exhibition grounds had been used for stock shows and small rodeos since before the war. A flat stretch of packed caliche ringed by wood-plank grandstands and a double row of bucking chutes on the east side. There wasn't much to look at in daylight. Weathered rails, cracked paint on the number plates, dust that never really settled. But on New Year's Eve they strung lights across the top rails, and the local band set up on a flatbed trailer near the announcer's box, and families came in from the ranches in the town to watch a handful of exhibition rides and wait for midnight. Spur belonged to a man named Clayton Voigt, the stock boss who managed the livestock rotation and made sure gates opened and closed in the right order during events. He was 52 that winter, a man with calloused hands and a voice he rarely raised. He had a reputation in Kerr County for being steady with animals and stricter than most about safety. People trusted him to work alone because he never cut corners and never left a gate unchained. He'd raised Spur from a pup out of a litter born on his own ranch, and the dog worked cattle the way some men work alone. Focused, deliberate, and impossible to distract. Voigt's wife had stayed home that night with their daughter, who was still recovering from a winter cold that had kept her in bed most of the week. Voigt told her he'd be back by 1 in the morning, 2 at the latest, once the crowd cleared and the gates were locked. He never made it home at all. The night started clean. Firecrackers popped like dry twigs in the hands of boys near the fence line, sharp little bursts that made the younger horses shift in their pens. The exhibition riders took their turns on broncs that were more tired than wild, and the crowd clapped and stamped their boots on the grandstand planks. Around 11:30, while the band tuned up for Auld Lang Syne, Voigt had Spur on a short rope near the stock pens on the north side, keeping him clear of the noise and the firecracker smoke. One of the ranch hands, a man named Orley Moss, saw Voigt bend down and check the dog's collar with both hands, making sure the buckle was tight and the leather wasn't frayed. Moss said later that Voigt seemed calm, that he scratched the dog behind the ears the way he always did, that there was nothing unusual about the moment. That was the last time anyone saw them together. Somewhere just before midnight, while the firecrackers were still going off in bursts and the band was building toward the final verse, Spur slipped the rope. Moss said later he saw the dog lope across the open dirt toward the bucking chutes on the east end, head low and tail straight, moving like he'd been called by someone standing in the dark beyond the lights. Voigt went after him without hesitation, calling his name once, maybe twice, his voice swallowed by the noise of the crowd and the music. The grandstands were full and loud, and most people didn't notice a man and a dog crossing the empty arena. By the time the band struck up Auld Lang Syne and the crowd rose to sing, Voigt was gone and Spur was gone. And what happened in the next 10 minutes left the kind of marks in the dirt and on the metal that people in Texas still won't talk about in daylight. The first man to notice something wrong was Moss himself, who was stationed near chute 3 to make sure the gate chain stayed clear for the last ride of the night. He said the chain on that chute rattled its full length just after midnight, loud enough to hear over the music, a metallic sound that carried across the empty dirt like something heavy had pulled it taut and then let go. Then the chain laid itself down on the ground, straight as a ruler, every link flat and even, stretched out in a perfect line with no kinks and no coils and no hand to arrange it. When Moss bent to pick it up, the metal was warm to the touch, not sun warm because the sun had been down for hours, not friction warm because no one had been pulling on it, warm like it had been held in a fist for a long time, like body heat soaked into iron. Moss called for the other hands, and within minutes they were spreading out through the chutes and under the grandstand with flashlights and lanterns, looking for Voigt and the dog. The hoof dust in the arena was doing something strange near the south end, rising in slow circles no bigger than a dinner plate. Little whirlwinds that turned in place where no hooves had kicked, and no boots had scuffed, and no wind was blowing through the rails. Two of the men stood 10 feet apart and watched the dust rise and fall in perfect spirals, and neither one of them said a word about what they were seeing. Under the grandstand, where the support posts sank into softer dirt and the shadows pooled thick even with lantern light, they found Spur's tracks. The prints ran straight back from the edge of the arena floor, clear and deep, four-pawed and purposeful, the kind of stride a dog makes when it's moving with intent. Then, halfway to the back support post, the tracks turned, not pivoted, not circled, turned. The hind paws faced forward and the front paws faced back, as if the dog had reversed itself mid-stride and walked the rest of the way backward, heel first, without breaking rhythm and without dragging. The prints were clean, evenly spaced, deliberate. They stopped at the post. There was no scuff, no turn, no sign the dog had sat or circled or done anything a living animal would do when it reached a barrier. The tracks just ended, as if Spur had walked backward into the post and ceased to exist. Above them, inside the empty grandstand where no spectators had been allowed to stand during the rides, someone had pressed a hand flat against the brass number plate mounted above chute 3. The print was there in the condensation, clear as a palm pressed to a fogged window. 5 fingers, a broad palm, the kind of mark that forms when warm skin meets cold metal. But the air that night was cool and dry, and there was no reason for the brass to sweat. One of the men reached up and touched the plate with the back of his hand. He said later it was warm, warmer than his own skin, warmer than any metal had a right to be in January air in the hill country of Texas. At 11 after midnight, while the men were still searching the chutes and calling Voight's name into the dark, a dog barked. It was short, sharp, unmistakable, the kind of bark Spur gave when he wanted attention or saw something move in the herd. And it came from beneath the arena floor, from under the packed dirt itself, deep enough and muffled enough that it shouldn't have had the air or the space to carry. 3 men heard it clearly. One of them, a ranch hand named Byers, knelt in the dirt and pressed his ear flat to the ground. He said later he thought he heard scratching after the bark, faint and rhythmic, like claws on wood planks or a dog digging at a door from the inside. But the arena floor was caliche laid over hard-pan clay. There was no wood underneath. There was no crawl space, no hollow, no cellar. There was nothing but earth and rock and a sound that had no place to come from. At midnight, while the crowd was filing out through the main gates and the band was packing up their instruments, one of the stock hands found the collar. It was sitting upright on a fence post near the cattle pens, 20 yards west of where Voight had last been seen with the dog on the rope. The collar was still clasped shut, the buckle fastened, the leather loop closed tight as if it had never been removed. The only way to take that collar off a dog was to unbuckle it or cut it, and it hadn't been cut. The leather was intact, unbroken, still damp to the touch and faintly warm, and it smelled like wood smoke even though the nearest fire pit had gone cold hours before the event started. The hand who found it held it up in the lantern light and called the others over, and no one wanted to be the first to say out loud what it meant, that the collar had come off a dog without being opened, and that it had been placed on that post by something with hands careful enough not to leave a mark. By dawn, the grounds crew was standing in a loose group near the stock trucks parked at the north end of the lot, unwilling to go back into the chutes or under the grandstand alone. 2 of them swore they had heard bells in the hour before sunrise, small, rhythmic, metallic, like the kind tied to a stock harness or a bridle, coming from inside one of the cattle trucks that had been parked and locked since 10 o'clock the night before. The sound repeated in short intervals, 3 rings and then silence, 3 rings and then silence. When they finally opened the back gate of the truck and shone a light inside, the bed was empty. The bells, if they had ever been there at all, were gone. There was no harness, no tack, no piece of metal that could have made that sound. Voight's wife, Mary, came to the grounds just after sunrise with their daughter beside her in the truck. She stepped out into the cold morning light and walked across the empty arena to where the men were standing near chute 3. One of them handed her the collar without a word. She held it in both hands, turning it over slowly, running her thumb across the damp leather and the closed buckle. And then she looked up and asked where her husband was. No one had an answer. The sun was up, the grandstands were empty, the lights were off, and the dirt under the bleachers still showed those backward tracks leading to the post, clear and deliberate and impossible to explain. After that year, the Kerr County exhibition grounds closed the main gates before midnight on New Year's Eve, and they never opened them again until the sun was up on January 1st. No one argued with the rule. No one asked why. The tradition spread to other stock grounds in the hill country, quiet and unspoken, passed from one foreman to the next. Men in Texas still won't say why out loud, not in full sentences, but if you ask the old stock hands who worked the hill country rodeos in the years after the war, they'll tell you there are some nights when you don't leave the gates open, and some sounds you don't follow into the dark, and some tracks you don't try to make sense of, no matter how clear they look in the dirt. The search for Clayton Voigt began in earnest at first light on January 1st, and by the time the sun cleared the mesquite line to the east, there were more than 30 men standing in the exhibition grounds, with lanterns still lit from the night before. Most of them were ranch hands and stock workers who had been at the event the previous evening. A few were neighbors from the properties nearest to the grounds, men who had heard about the disappearance before dawn and come in trucks with their dogs and their rifles. No one believed Voigt had simply walked off. He wasn't the kind of man who left without a word, and he wasn't the kind of man who forgot his dog. The timeline made no sense from the beginning. Orley Moss, the shoot hand who had seen Voigt check Spur's collar just before midnight, said he had last seen them together at approximately 11:30, near the stock pens on the north end. At 11:40, another hand named Byers saw Spur running loose across the arena floor toward the bucking chutes, and he saw Voigt following on foot, calling the dog's name. By midnight, when the band finished Auld Lang Syne and the crowd began to disperse, both Voigt and the dog were gone. The collar was found at 12:30 on a fence post 20 yards from where Voigt had been standing half an hour earlier. The backward tracks under the grandstand were discovered within minutes of that. And at 11 after midnight, before the collar was found, before anyone knew Voigt was missing, 3 men heard the dog bark from beneath the arena floor. It was his bark, Byers said, standing near the south end of the arena with his hat in his hands. I worked with that dog for 2 years. I know what he sounds like. But if the bark came at 11 after midnight, and the collar was already sitting on the post by 12:30, then Spur had been without his collar for more than an hour, and somehow still under the ground barking. And if Voigt had followed the dog into the chutes just before midnight, where had he been for those 30 minutes before the men started searching? The grounds weren't large. There were only so many places a man could go, and Voigt knew every inch of them. The search started with a simple grid. The men spread out in a line across the arena floor, walking shoulder to shoulder from the grandstands to the chutes, their boots scuffing up dust that hung in the still morning air. They checked behind every post, inside every pen, under every section of bleacher seating. They called Voigt's name until their voices went hoarse. They found nothing. By mid-morning, they had widened the search beyond the grounds themselves, moving out into the scrub and thorn fence that bordered the property to the south and west. They tied strips of torn cloth to the fence posts as they went, marking the sections they had already covered so no ground would be searched twice. The dogs, 3 cattle dogs and a hound brought in from a neighboring ranch, worked the fence line with their noses low, pulling hard on their leads. For the first hour they moved steadily, following scent trails that looped and doubled back but always seemed to lead nowhere. Then, just past noon, all 4 dogs stopped at once. They were near the southwest corner of the property, where the land dipped into a shallow draw thick with mesquite and prickly pear. The dogs planted their feet, pulled back against their leads, and refused to go forward. One of them, the hound, lay down flat in the dirt and whined, a high and continuous sound that made the hair on the back of one handler's neck stand up. The men tried to coax them forward. They tried pulling. They tried walking ahead to show the dogs there was nothing to fear. The dogs would not move. After 10 minutes, the handlers gave up and led them back toward the main grounds, and none of the animals stopped shaking until they were clear of the draw. I've had that hound for 6 years, the owner said later, standing near the stock pens with a cigarette he didn't light. She's tracked wild hogs through worse country than that. I've never seen her quit. In the early afternoon, Mary Voigt returned to the grounds with a group of women from the church in Kerrville. They brought coffee and sandwiches and set up a table under the grandstand, and they stayed there through the long hours of the search, waiting. Mary did not speak much. She sat on a bench with the collar in her lap, turning it over and over in her hands, and once she said to one of the other women, "He wouldn't leave this behind. Not for anything." By late afternoon, the men had covered every section of the grounds and the surrounding scrub within a quarter mile. They had found no footprints beyond the backward tracks under the grandstand, no torn clothing, no sign of a struggle or a fall. They had dragged hooks through the stock tanks on the north end, shallow concrete basins used for watering cattle, and found nothing but silt and algae. They had climbed onto the roofs of the equipment sheds and scanned the horizon in every direction. Voight was gone, and the ground had swallowed him without leaving a trace. Then, just before sunset, one of the hands noticed something strange. He was walking the fence line on the east side of the property, checking the rag strips they had tied that morning, when he saw a strip of cloth knotted to a post that he was certain had not been there an hour before. It was the same kind of torn fabric they had been using, white cotton, frayed at the edges, but it was tied differently, looped twice around the post, and knotted tight, and it was positioned exactly opposite a strip he himself had tied earlier in the day. He called 2 other men over. All 3 of them stood there looking at the new strip, and none of them could say for certain who had tied it or when. "We already checked this section," one of them said. "I marked it myself this morning." The other man reached out and touched the fabric. It was damp, as if it had been soaked and wrung out. Even though it hadn't rained in Kerr County in more than a week, and the air that day had been dry. As the sun went down, the men gathered near the stock pens to decide whether to continue the search through the night. Most of them were in favor of it. They set up lanterns along the fence line and prepared to walk the grid again, this time by lamplight. But the older hands, men who had worked stock in the hill country for decades, men who remembered things that had happened on other ranches in other years, began to pull the younger men aside and speak to them in low voices. "You don't check that draw alone," one of them said. "Not after dark. Not after what the dogs did." Another one, a man in his 60s who had worked the Kerr County grounds since before the war, stood near the gate and said, "We'll keep looking, but 2 men together from now on. No one walks the fence line alone." No one argued with him. Just after 8 o'clock that evening, while a group of 6 men was walking the southern fence line with lanterns held high, they heard a whistle. It was short, sharp, 2 notes rising and falling. The kind of whistle cattlemen use to call a dog or signal across a pasture. It came from somewhere to the west, past the thorn fence and out into the open scrub. 2 of the men stopped and turned toward the sound. Then, less than 5 seconds later, they heard the same whistle again. This time from the east, back toward the arena. Same pitch, same rhythm, same 2 notes. "That was Clayton's whistle," one of the men said. "His name was Harlan, and he had worked under Voight for 3 years. That's how he called Spur." They stood in silence, waiting for the whistle to come again. It didn't. The night air was still and cold, and the only sound was the faint creak of the grandstand wood settling in the temperature drop. By 10 o'clock, the search had slowed. The men were tired, their voices worn down to murmurs, and the lantern oil was running low. They agreed to stop for the night and resume at first light. Most of them went home. A few stayed, sitting in trucks near the main gate with the headlights on, unwilling to leave the grounds completely dark. Just before midnight, one of the men still on the grounds, a stock hand named Pruitt, was standing near Chute 3, smoking and watching the empty arena. He said later that he saw a light move across the dirt near the center of the floor, low to the ground, steady and yellowish like lantern light. But there was no one out there. He called to the men in the trucks, and by the time they came running with their own lights, the glow was gone. They walked out into the center of the arena together and found nothing. No lantern, no footprints, no warm metal, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Pruitt swore he had seen it. The others didn't argue with him, but no one went back out into the arena alone after that. On the second day, the search became a ritual. The men walked the grid again, this time expanding outward past the original quarter-mile boundary. They brought in 2 more dogs, both of them younger and supposedly more aggressive than the ones that had refused to enter the draw. Both of the new dogs made it 15 yards past the spot where the others had stopped, and then they lay down in the dirt and refused to move. One of them urinated where it lay, a fear response the handler said he had only seen once before years ago, when the dog had cornered a rabid coyote in a barn. By noon on the second day, the men had stopped talking about finding Voight alive. They were looking for a body now, though no one said it out loud. They checked the stock tanks again. They walked the dry creek bed that ran along the western edge of the property. They pried up loose boards in the equipment sheds and checked the spaces underneath. They climbed down into the shallow drainage culvert that ran under the access road. They found nothing. That evening, just before sunset, Mary Voigt walked out into the center of the arena alone. She stood there for a long time holding the collar in both hands, and then she knelt in the dirt and pressed her palm flat to the ground where the dust had risen in circles the night her husband disappeared. When she stood up, her hand was warm. Not from the sun, because the sun was almost down, but warm like she had pressed it to a stove. She walked back to the grandstand without a word and sat down on the bench, and she didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the night. By the end of the second day, the older men in Kerr County had begun to create rules that would outlast the search itself. No one works the grounds alone after sunset. No one answers a whistle they can't see the source of. No one goes past the draw where the dog stopped, not for any reason, not even in daylight. The rules were not written down. They were spoken quietly, passed from one man to the next, and they were followed without question. On the morning of the third day, just after dawn, one of the stock hands found something that stopped the search cold. It was a piece of paper, folded once and wedged into a gap between two boards on the side of the equipment shed nearest to the bucking chutes. The paper was clean, uncreased except for the single fold, and it had 4 words written on it in pencil and handwriting that Mary Voigt recognized immediately as her husband's. The note said, "Check the bell rope." The note was brought to Mary Voigt just after 7 in the morning on the third day. She was sitting in the cab of her truck near the main gate, her daughter asleep in the seat beside her, when Orly Moss walked over and handed her the folded paper through the open window. She unfolded it slowly, read the 4 words twice, and then sat without moving for a long time. Her fingers pressed white against the edges of the paper. "That's his handwriting," she said finally. Her voice was flat, emptied out. "That's Clayton's hand." Moss nodded. He had known it the moment he saw the note. Voigt's writing was clean and deliberate, the kind of script a man develops when he keeps ledgers and writes instructions that other men need to follow without confusion. The letters were unmistakable. "Where did you find it?" Mary asked. "Equipment shed," Moss said. "Wedged in the boards near chute 3. We checked that shed twice already. It wasn't there yesterday." Mary looked past him toward the shed, then down at the note again. "What bell rope?" There was no bell on the exhibition grounds. There never had been. The nearest bell of any kind was at the Baptist Church in Kerrville, 4 miles to the east, but the note said to check the bell rope, and it was written in Clayton Voigt's hand, and no one could explain how it had appeared in a building that had been searched and locked the day before. By 8 o'clock, more than 20 men had gathered near the equipment shed. They stood in a loose circle, silent, while 2 of them pried the door open and stepped inside with lanterns. The shed was small, 10 feet by 12, used for storing tools and spare tack. There were coils of rope hanging from nails on the back wall, lariat rope, lead rope, lengths of cotton cord used for tying gates. None of it was bell rope. None of it was connected to anything that rang. But near the back corner, half hidden behind a stack of wooden crates, they found a length of hemp rope hanging from a ceiling beam. It was old, thicker than the other ropes, darkened with age and use. The bottom end was frayed and hung about 5 feet off the ground, swaying slightly even though the air in the shed was still. One of the men reached out to touch it, then pulled his hand back. "It's warm," he said. The other man stepped closer and wrapped his hand around the rope. He held it for a moment, then let go and stepped back. "Warm all the way up," he said. "Like it's been pulled." They followed the rope up to the beam. It didn't go through a pulley or attach to anything mechanical. It simply looped over the beam and disappeared into the shadows of the ceiling. One of the men climbed onto the crates and ran his hand along the beam. The rope was knotted tight to the wood, tied off in a bowline that looked decades old. But the rope itself was warm to the touch, and when he tugged on it gently, he heard a faint metallic sound from somewhere above. A soft chime, distant and muffled, like a bell wrapped in cloth. They went outside and looked up at the roof of the shed. There was nothing there. No bell, no fixture, no chimney or vent that could carry sound. The roof was flat tin, rusted at the seams. "Pull it," someone said. The man on the crates hesitated, then gave the rope a single firm pull. The chime came again, clearer this time, a single note that seemed to come from inside the walls rather than above them. It was a church sound, a funeral sound, and it made every man in the shed take a step toward the door. They did not pull the rope again. By mid-morning, word of the note and the bell rope had spread through the search party. The search had changed. It was no longer about covering ground or finding a body. It was about trying to make sense of something that refused to be made sense of, and the longer they searched, the more the physical evidence seemed to contradict itself. In the early afternoon, a group of men was walking the fence line on the south end when they found a second strip of cloth tied to a post they had marked themselves the day before. The new strip was tied in the same double-loop knot as the one they had found on the second day, and it was damp, even though the afternoon sun had been hot and dry. One of the men untied it and held it up to the light. The fabric smelled faintly of smoke. "This is the same cloth we've been using," he said, "but I didn't tie this one." They continued walking, and 20 yards farther on they found another new strip, then another, each one tied to a post in the same way, each one damp and smelling faintly of wood smoke. By the time they reached the end of the section, they had found 7 new strips, all of them placed in positions that should have been impossible. Posts they had checked that morning, posts they had walked past less than an hour before. One of the men said, "Someone's following us." Another one said, "Or leading us." That afternoon, Mary Voigt walked out into the arena alone for the second time. She carried the collar in one hand and the note in the other, and she stood in the center of the dirt floor where her husband had last been seen. She called his name 3 times, her voice strong and clear, and then she waited in silence. The men watching from the grandstand said later that the air around her seemed to shift, the way heat distorts a view across flat ground in summer, even though the day was cool. Mary stood there for 5 full minutes, unmoving, and then she walked back to the grandstand without saying a word. By evening, the search had taken on the rhythm of a vigil. The men moved slowly, methodically, walking sections of ground they had already covered multiple times. The women from the church had set up a station under the grandstand, with folding tables and urns of coffee that stayed hot through the night. A pastor from Kerrville came and stood near the gate, offering prayers that felt inadequate against the silence of the empty grounds. The theory started that night, whispered in small groups near the trucks. Some said Voigt had enemies. He had been stock boss for nearly a decade, and he had fired men for carelessness, for mistreating animals. Maybe one of them had come back. Maybe the note was a taunt. Others said it was the land. The hill country was full of sinkholes and caves that opened without warning. Maybe Voigt had fallen through, and everything else, the warm collar, the backward tracks, the note, was just the mind trying to make patterns out of grief. A few said it wasn't a man at all that had left the note. They didn't say what they thought it was, but they said the note had appeared in a locked shed, written in Voigt's hand, days after he vanished. They said the collar had been removed from a dog without being unbuckled. They said the rope in the shed had rung a bell that didn't exist. They said these things quietly, and they did not repeat them in daylight. On the morning of the 4th day, one of the stock hands found the collar again. It was sitting on the same fence post where it had been found the first night, in exactly the same position. Upright, clasped shut, the leather damp and faintly warm. The man who found it was certain the post had been empty an hour before. Mary Voigt was brought out to see it. She stood in front of the post, then reached out and picked it up. She turned it over in her hands, checking the buckle, the stitching, the worn leather. "This is the same collar," she said. "We put the other one in your truck," Moss said carefully. "Day before yesterday." Mary looked at him, then back at the collar. "I know," she said. "It's in a box on my kitchen table. I saw it this morning." There was a long silence. Then one of the men said, "So there's 2 of them now." No one wanted to touch the second collar. Mary wrapped it in a piece of cloth and placed it in the bed of her truck, and no one went near it for the rest of the day. By the 5th day, the official search had ended. The men still came to the grounds, but they came in smaller groups, and they no longer walked the grid or called Voight's name. They stood near the gate and spoke in low voices, and they began to create the rules that would define the grounds for the next generation. No one goes into the equipment shed alone. No one touches the bell rope. No one walks the draw past the southwest corner, and if the dogs won't go, you don't go either. No one answers a whistle they can't see the source of. And if you find something that wasn't there before, a strip of cloth, a note, a collar, you call for another man before you pick it up. The older hands in Kerr County taught these rules to the younger ones without explaining why, and the younger ones followed them because they had seen enough. On the 7th day, Mary Voigt stopped coming to the grounds. She had the 2 collars in her house now, both of them identical, both of them still faintly warm when she touched them in the early morning. She kept them in a wooden box in the kitchen, away from her daughter. Once, late at night, she thought she heard a dog bark from inside the box, short and sharp, the way Spur used to bark. She did not open the box to check. She sat at the kitchen table until the sun came up, and then she carried the box out to the truck and brought it back to the exhibition grounds. She left it on the bench under the grandstand with a note that said, "These belong here." No one moved the box. It sat on that bench for 3 weeks until finally one of the stockhands carried it into the equipment shed and placed it on a high shelf in the back corner, behind the crates, near the rope that rang a bell no one could see. The box is still there as far as anyone knows. No one has opened it. No one talks about what might be inside. After the first week, the story of Clayton Voigt stopped being a search and became something else. A scar, a set of rules that governed behavior in ways that felt older than logic. People in Kerr County still don't walk the exhibition grounds alone after dark. They still close the gates before midnight on New Year's Eve, and if you ask them why, they'll tell you it's tradition, or safety, or just the way things are done. But if you push them, if you ask what really happened in January of 1946, they'll look past you toward the old grandstand, and they'll say, some things don't need to be said out loud. The exhibition grounds in Kerr County stayed closed for the rest of January 1946. The gates were chained, the grandstands left empty, and the dirt in the arena floor was allowed to settle undisturbed. By February, the county had posted a notice saying the grounds would reopen for the spring livestock show. But when the date came, fewer than half the usual exhibitors showed up. The ones who did arrive worked quickly, kept their voices low, and left before sunset. No one stayed overnight. No one worked alone. By summer, the Kerr County Cattlemen's Association had voted to move the annual exhibition to a different site, a newly cleared field 3 miles north of Kerrville, with better access to the highway and, as the chairman put it, fewer complications. The old grounds were sold to a rancher who used the land for hay storage and kept the gates locked year-round. The grandstands were dismantled in 1948. The bucking chutes were torn down a year after that. By 1950, the only structures left standing were the equipment shed and the stock pens, and both of them were considered unsafe for use. But the rules that had been created during the search for Clayton Voigt did not disappear with the buildings. They spread outward from the old exhibition site like cracks in glass, quiet and persistent, shaping the behavior of ranch hands and stock workers across the hill country in ways that most of them could not fully explain. New workers hired onto ranches in Kerr County, and the surrounding areas were taught within their first week that you never check a fence line alone before sunrise. You never answer a whistle unless you can see who's calling. You never go into an equipment shed at night without announcing yourself first. And you never touch a rope hanging from a beam unless you know exactly what it's tied to. The older hands who taught these rules did not explain their origins. They simply said, that's how it's done here. And the younger ones followed because they understood in some unspoken way that the rules existed for reasons that went deeper than safety or tradition. Mothers in the towns around Kerr County began telling their children not to play near the old exhibition site, even after the grandstands were gone and the land had been cleared. They said the ground was uneven, that there were sinkholes, that it wasn't safe. But the real reason, the one they didn't say out loud, was that children who played near that site sometimes came home talking about sounds they had heard. A dog barking from under the dirt, a bell ringing once in the middle of the afternoon, a two-note whistle that seemed to come from two directions at once. The children were never hurt, but they were uneasy, and their unease was enough to make the mothers keep them away. In 1952, a ranch hand working on the property that now included the old exhibition site went into the equipment shed to retrieve a length of chain. He found the wooden box on the high shelf in the back corner, covered in dust, and he opened it without thinking. Inside were two dog collars, both of them identical, both of them clasped shut. He picked one up, and later he said it was warm in his hand. Warmer than it should have been after sitting in a closed shed for 6 years. He put the collar back, closed the box, and left the shed. He did not go back inside for the rest of the season, and when his contract ended in the fall, he took a job in a different county and did not return to Kerr County again. The box was found again in 1959 by a teenager hired to clean out the shed before it was demolished. By then there were 3 collars inside, all of them identical, all of them clasped shut. The teenager brought the box to the rancher, who looked at it for a long time and then told him to put it back exactly where he had found it. The shed was not demolished. It stands to this day, though no one uses it for storage anymore, and the box, as far as anyone knows, is still on that shelf in the back corner. Over the decades, the story of Clayton Voigt became something other than a disappearance. It became a template, a way of understanding other events that did not fit comfortably into the categories of accident or crime. When a ranch hand in Gillespie County went missing in 1961 and was found 3 days later with no memory of where he had been, people said it was like what happened in Kerr County. When a dog in Blanco County came home without its collar in 1973, and the collar was found the next day sitting on a fence post with no explanation, people said it was like Voigt's dog. The details were different, but the shape of the strangeness was the same, and people in the hill country recognized that shape and knew what it meant, that there were things in the land and the night that did not follow the rules of the everyday world, and that the best response was not to investigate but to create boundaries and stay within them. By the 1980s, most of the people who had been present during the search for Voigt were gone. Mary Voigt had passed away in 1967. Orley Moss died in 1979. The younger hands who had learned the rules secondhand were now the older hands, teaching a new generation, and the story had softened into something almost like folklore. People said that a man had disappeared at the old exhibition grounds back in the 40s, that his dog had vanished with him, that strange things had happened during the search. They said you didn't go to that site alone and you didn't answer sounds you couldn't account for, and you followed the rules not because you believed in ghosts, but because the rules had kept people safe for 40 years, and there was no reason to stop following them now. But every few years something would happen that brought the story back into sharper focus. In 1991, a surveyor working near the old site reported hearing a dog bark from beneath the ground while he was setting up his equipment. He marked the spot and called for a ground-penetrating radar team, thinking there might be a collapsed cellar or a sinkhole. The radar showed nothing, solid earth, no cavities, no voids. The surveyor finished his work and left, and he did not include the incident in his report. In 2003, a man renovating a barn on the property found a rusted chain lying in the dirt near the foundation. The chain was laid out in a perfectly straight line, every link flat and even, as if it had been arranged by hand. The man picked it up, and he said later that it was warm, warmer than the sun could have made it, and that it smelled faintly of smoke. He hung the chain on a nail in the barn and did not touch it again. In 2015, a woman walking her dog near the old site at dusk said the dog stopped suddenly, planted its feet, and refused to move forward. She tried to coax it, then tried to pull it, and finally she picked the dog up and carried it. As she was walking back to her truck, she heard a whistle, 2 notes rising and falling like a cattleman calling a herd. She did not see anyone. The land around her was flat and open, and there was nowhere for a person to hide. She put the dog in the truck and drove home, and she did not walk near that site again. People in Kerr County still follow the rules even now, even the ones who have never heard the full story of Clayton Voigt. They follow them because their parents followed them, and because their grandparents followed them, and because there is a deep and persistent understanding in the hill country that some places hold on to events in ways that time does not erase. The old exhibition site is one of those places. It looks like any other stretch of Texas scrubland: mesquite, dry grass, a few scattered fence posts. But people who live nearby know not to go there alone, not to linger after sunset, and not to answer sounds that seem to come from the wrong direction or the wrong depth. There are three versions of what happened to Clayton Voigt on New Year's Eve in 1946. The first version is human. Someone killed him. Someone with a grudge or a debt or a reason no one ever uncovered, and they hid the body well enough that it was never found. The second version is natural. He fell into a sinkhole or a fissure, the dog followed, and everything else, the warm collar, the backward tracks, the note, the bell rope, was coincidence, grief, the way frightened people see patterns and randomness. The third version is the one no one in Texas says out loud, the one that accounts for the note written in his handwriting days after he disappeared, the collars that multiplied in a box no one opened, the chain that laid itself out straight and warm, the bell that rang in a shed with no bell, the dog that barked from under solid ground. The third version says that something in that place on that night took Clayton Voigt and his dog in a way that does not fit into the language of crime or accident, and that it left behind just enough evidence to make sure no one would ever forget. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one that people in Kerr County still won't name? Even now, even after 80 years. And if the impossible version is the right one, what does it mean that the collars are still warm, that the sounds still come from under the ground, that the rules created in 1946 are still followed without question by people who have never met Clayton Voigt or heard his dog bark? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.